Okay. Good evening, gentlemen. We are
Good evening.
here to continue our dialogue on Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, the series by John Vervake. And today we'll be covering and discussing episodes 13, 14, and 15. As always, these are just dialogue among us to make sense of the work, not any definitive commentary. This is just an attempt to understand the material by engaging in it. So, who wants to kick off on the 13, which was Buddhism and parasitic processing?
I can give that a go since I just reviewed it. Okay, so see if I can make this coherent. So sati, did I say that right? Hopefully, deep remembering, right? So we're talking about wisdom and self-transcendence as being, a very important thing that he's focusing on, and especially the being mode, which he later says that Buddhism is about focusing on the being mode rather than the getting and obtaining mode. And he was talking about how problematic our interpretation of Buddhism is in the West, according to him and certain other experts, which I happen to agree with because I had a hard time with Buddhism until aspects until I actually read this, and I was like, oh God, is that what that means? I mean, that makes much more sense. And I think one of his main thrusts is it's not, we think in the West that we have to change our beliefs, and he's arguing that that doesn't create transformation. And he explains later, because of the mechanisms of adaptation, that that's why it doesn't work. So you have to go through a transformative process through participation and perspective changing before you actually know something differently. So you're altering the agent-agenda relationship. And essentially what he's saying is, if there's no practice, meaning practicing the shifting of perspective and engagement, then there's no understanding and no transformation. And so he's correcting that Buddhism is not a set of beliefs, and instead it's a way of being and practicing that alters your fundamental view of things and ability to shift your view, I believe is what he said. And he was saying ideologies fail to create meaning because they just dance on the surface of the quote Western idea of knowing. So Buddhism means remember the being mode, and so you're for the perspectival knowing, you're transforming the states of consciousness at the participation level. And what that does is it reorients the core machinery of self, and that drives this upward spiral of growth and consciousness expansion. And then he talks about the Four Noble Truths. So these are, as I understand it, practices that provoke people to change the same way that Buddha did, right? So what you're doing is you're stepping into his way of being, and then you're walking the way he did, so to say, metaphorically, and coming to a transformation through that. And also that he was through those noble truths, and one of them was that life is suffering. As actually doesn't mean that. What it means is that we are threatened by our tendency to orient ourselves in insane ways. Anger leads to insanity, kind of a loss of agency and loss of freedom, and then we become self-destructive and self-deceptive as a result. And then he talks about heuristics and how those are survival based, and they're very useful, and unless they be wired inappropriately and lead to a reduction of ability to solve problems, because what you do is you get into this loop of fear and a sense of loss of agency, and then you get more fearful because you don't think you have agency, and then that's the parasitic processing, where you're just downward spiral, narrow. You have less and less ability to solve things properly because you're in a fear state, which narrows your ability to do things properly. And then he talks about the Eightfold Path, the right way of being, which is understanding and thinking, which is cognitive, speech, action, and livelihood, which is character, right mindfulness, and concentration, which is consciousness. And that if you follow these and practice them, it can lead to a transformation of self. Okay, that's my story.
Well
That's
done.
a sharp, quick summary.
Yeah, that's the Cliff Notes.
What spoke to you, Vish?
Well, a couple of different things, I think. And maybe I'm going to nitpick some of these.
Yeah,
But
sure.
I'll tell you the stuff that I sort of wrote down because I read it and I was like, that doesn't make sense to me. The first one is maybe very, very close to the beginning, where he's saying, I think the problem with seeing things from the inside is that tends to be very subjective. And of course, that means you're not understanding the phenomena as it is, but you're only seeing it through your own particular bias.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is, when is that ever not the case? Isn't every single internal event in our lives subjective? And like this whole idea of wisdom or sort of participatory knowledge seems
Participatory
very
knowledge.
internal to me.
Well, I think what he's saying is that you need to be able to break that frame by doing certain kinds of practices, which some of them he does list. And that's what the what do you call it? Psychotechnologies are for, is to shake up your orientation so that you can actually see things from a different perspective rather than being stuck in your one, because it's almost like you're on a different part of the tree. Someone's at the base of the tree, someone's at the top, other people in the middle, and they see things differently. But if you can learn how to move, or at least imagine what it's like to be at the bottom of the tree, you might actually get a different view than you have. That's my interpretation of it. What do you guys think?
Makes sense.
I have the same. I don't know if it's confusion or trouble with that. Like, how do I ever escape the subjective sense?
Exactly.
That doesn't really make sense. I do wonder though. I don't remember him saying that exactly. Do you remember the context that he was making that assertion in at all?
It's somewhere right at the beginning where he's talking about interpreting Buddhism either subjectively or objectively.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's helpful because I do remember him really making the point, and Michael recapped it already, that the of the four ways of knowing, Western civilization is strongly biased in the propositional. That's the
right.
scientific. I proposed the hypothesis. That's how I think about it anyway. So
Okay.
that propositional bias leads to, well, it opens the door to making the mistake, I suppose, the error that is the only way of knowing, and that's
Right.
the objective sense. You're objectifying reality. You're imagining that you're looking at it from outside, and that's real.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
I mean, the other thing I could say outside of what Vervaeke's saying is that McGilchrist explains that if you're in left brain dominance, that's actually where the form of knowing you guys just talked about comes from. And if you switch into a right brain dominance, you become aware of things in a totally different way because it's overview, it's integrative, it's relational, it's what do you call it? It's not, and it's what he's, and it's not is tied to time either, or it's a different kind of time perception too. It's a continual flow and evolution rather than this fragmented view, right? So I think that part of what he's saying in this course is that we need to learn how to break out of our perspective so that we can gain more potential wisdom from other people, but also from ourselves if we can stop just being stuck in these different modes of seeing. Because he even says there's a lot of different ways of knowing and loving. He talks about the modes of loving too in 16, which we won't necessarily go into right now. But I thought that was fascinating. I mean, I can't wait to talk about that with you guys because it's pretty rich in terms of that. So I mean, there's another piece here, though. I think that a lot of people assume that because we have one perspective, that we don't see reality. And I don't believe that anymore. What we see is a part of reality. It's not complete. But if it was so off, we wouldn't be alive. I mean,
Yeah.
are you know, right? Or you'd be a complete failure in your life because reality sorting there's proof of it to some degree, at least, on your effectiveness in your life. And if you're not homeless, and if not everyone hates you, then you're probably doing decently, right? It's like that's my take on it.
Okay. No, I think that's fair. There's two interesting points there. I think for the first one, I see what you're saying. I think my problem coming in, like when I asked the question, was even if I change my frame of reference, it's still moving from one kind of subjectivity to another. But I think something about Cam's explanation helped at least give me a different way of looking at it, which is as long as I'm looking at it through a propositional worldview, so through a belief system, then I'm stuck within that system. And that's what he's calling subjective. Whereas maybe what he's talking about is letting go of that and just participating, and that knowledge, that participatory knowledge is the non-subjective.
So no, so I think we are clarifying two things, if
Yeah.
I may.
Yeah,
Please.
please.
The fact that all experiences are subjective and first person is very foundational to Hinduism and Buddhist philosophy. So that's not what I think Vervaeke is referring to, that all experiences are ultimately subjective. I think what he's saying is that while all experiences are subjective, that is not being contested or even brought up. He's saying we have the ability to assume and understand the frame of somebody else. That's all. And that's perspectival knowing, that I can say, I understand what Vish's perspective is on this situation. It's still my subjectivity, but I can understand. This is the theory of mind, right? I can understand your perspective, Vish, and I can understand Michael's perspective, which might be different. And my understanding of that perspective might be still subjective, but the fact that I can shift my perspective is just one way of knowing.
That's fair.
That's all he's saying, right? Then he's not making any other claims about subjective objectivity, because then he switches to what he calls the four kinds of knowing, and in which, when he says propositional knowing, he's not saying it's subjective or objective. He's simply saying propositional knowing is just a kind of knowing that has its limitation because the way it is constructed from abstract concepts, etc. Right? And that's the whole idea of left brain, how it works, how it deals with abstractions and logic at that level in a narrow sense, not logos, but logic. So he's saying that's limiting largely because it doesn't enrich transformation. And then he now goes on to say why one of the four kinds is perspectival knowing. And so if you are able to switch your lens and say, I now understand your point of view, even if my understanding of your point of view is subjective, that is already improved. That's already an improvement, because now I can hold multiple points of view of an event or a situation, right? Which allows me more agency, which is what he's driving towards, right? Versus only saying, I have a certain perspective and I'm unable to see somebody else's, even my lock frame. That's how I took it. To me, what was really interesting about this whole chapter was Vervaeke frames Buddhism with a Western psychological cognitive scientist perspective, which he has, of course, which is very fresh, and I've not seen it. I had a chance to read Dhammapad, which is a relatively short book, which is the book to start Buddhism on, which describes in a very short form the Four Noble Truths and the Eighth Path, and actually has a chapter on each, etc. It's a classic text of Buddhism, and it's a fairly straightforward read called Dhammapad. And what's interesting is that if you live in that universe, you don't quite get the insight that Vervaeke has. And what's interesting about coming from that perspective is that it is a very psychological first person, like inner life perspective, Buddhist perspective, saying you are suffering, life is suffering, you're experiencing the suffering, and here are 4 truths about world. And those 4 truths, you could say, are propositional truths, like life is suffering and you can get relief from suffering. These are just, I would say, observations of life. But the real magic is not in those 4 observations, is in the Eightfold Path, which are very precise practices. And what's really the power of Buddhist, at least as the Buddhism, is that, to me, is that it does not posit metaphysics. Later on, people came on and talked about, nirvana and many other things, but it does not posit too much of metaphysics. And in fact, actively doesn't get into debates of what's God, what's not God, etc., metaphysical views of the world, how was universe formed, can you explain the origin of life? None of that, which other religions tend to have a point of view on. And because so much of focus is on the 4 truths, which are kind of like just statements and observations on the condition of life, and then the 8 paths, which are just practices. And the claim is you practice these 8 paths and you will be relieved of the misery or dukh or suffering.
Well,
so that part is interesting in and of itself. Sorry, go ahead, Cam.
We've gotten pretty far into this conversation and suffering has come up a couple of times. And when I listened to him on this section this time, I heard it in a way that I hadn't before. I hadn't caught it, where he really makes the point that the way that is interpreted. How did you say that? Life is suffering? Is that one of the
that's one of the noble truths, the first noble truth.
The point that he was making was you're under threat of
he reframes it.
Cognitive, your own, he says the cognitive processes that make you such a highly adaptable creature.
That's right.
Are the same processes that make you susceptible to self-destructive, self-deceptive behaviors.
Right, exactly.
That is a threat. That is an ever-present existential threat. And that's how he interpreted, or how I understand him to interpret that life, that noble truth that life is suffering. And that was very helpful for me, because I've really struggled with that word, suffering, that concept, suffering.
Well, he says that Buddha is basically saying that the suffering is loss of agency and freedom. That's what it actually means. It's not that life is actually all suffering, but there's a potential to suffer all the time if you lose agency and freedom. Because he says that Buddhism is fundamentally an orientation about how not to lose freedom. That's what he says.
By perspectival and participatory practices.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly.
That to me is the Vervaeke interpretation.
No, he says it is.
That's all, right? So what I was describing earlier was what I think is in the Buddhist text and what Buddha approaches it as. And then what I think Vervaeke does is to frame it in psychological sense. With the idea of parasitic processing, which is a psychological process of anxiety-driven loop and diminishing of your worldview, where you kind of center yourself in a, call it anxiety loop, and you can't think outside. All of that is a psychological interpretation, which rightfully Vervaeke is adding. And this idea that suffering is loss of agency also is, Cogsci perspective. So I think it's all very interesting that how he's saying that today in the West, we have loss of meaning. And part of it is the parasitic processing that is happening in the West, the mental health crisis. Everybody's like, doesn't know how to make sense of it. And they get so anxiety driven that they can't even reframe their thinking, can't understand perspective of the people who are, let's say, political opponents, etc. So all those things are happening right now in the West, and it's locking us into this suffering and parasitic loop, which he's saying Buddha had a perspective. You follow these 8 paths, eightfold path, and you could actually relieve yourself of that suffering. So that's really the bridge I found very interesting.
I don't
Like,
remember now if Vervaeke makes this point in this episode, but one of the things that struck me was this is kind of a case of negative exaptation, isn't it? Like what he calls parasitic processing
absolutely, yes, that's
is
exactly
what
right.
in all of the earlier chapters he's been focusing on the other half of it, which is here's a good way we can repurpose the same mechanisms to do other useful things. But in this particular case, it's the same mechanisms that let me predict the world kind of get me stuck in this mode of always expecting the worst. Or
Yeah. The Buddhist view would be is a desire, Trishna.
yeah,
So it's the moment you have desire, which is part of your human agency, it gets you into suffering.
It's an interesting parallel between what he says about how Buddha frames this and what trauma is. Because trauma is fundamentally the inability to get out of that spiral of feeling like you can't have agency. So it's really, when I was reading this, I'm like, damn, that's incredible. How, Buddha figured that out how long ago? I mean, it's like, because it's only currently that the neuroscience has proven that to be the case. Like, in other words, it's a loss of agency that is real and it's physiological. So you can't even actually think your way out of it. You have to practice yourself out of it through, physical and other practices. You have to embody a different way to get out. And and sometimes you need other therapies, but anyway, yeah, very interesting.
Should we move on to Epicureans, Cynics, and Stoics?
I think we should.
Cam, what do you think of that?
There was one piece of key vocabulary from episode 13 that if you guys have anything to add to it, I would love to hear your thoughts. And that is the hyperbolic discounting came up again in this one. He had covered it in some previous episode. He referenced back to it. And I don't feel like I have a very good grasp of that concept. And if any of you do, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Damn good question. And it's one of those things where I thought
if
I got
not,
it.
we can pass and move on.
I missed it. I don't have any perspective
here.
What are your thoughts on it, Cam?
Well, I don't know the word very well. So when I hear hyperbolic, I imagine that there's some relation to parabolic. So it's something like the tendency to dismiss information out of hand, like to immediately dismiss without a full acceptance, without a full knowing or a fuller knowing, is how I hear hyperbolic discounting. So as things, I think it was in one of the previous episodes where he was talking about the smoker. So because the eventuality is so far removed in the future, it's discounted. The consequence of the action is discounted. But I feel feeble in my grasp of it, and I feel like it's an important one for me anyway to get a hold of.
My understanding of it is closer to what you said at the end, which is we do a very bad job of understanding things that aren't going to happen right away. And so it feels like the other way of looking at proximity bias, which is that the things closest to us are the most recency bias is another one, right? The things that are the most immediate in our future or our past are the ones that are weighted the most heavily. And the farther away you go into the future, the easier it is to discount it.
I just looked it up, and it kind of summarizes it more or less. It's immediate gratification is how you could translate it if you want to do a very simple explanation. So yeah,
which is adaptive. So in some instances, like the tiger, the proximal tiger, the discounting, like the immediacy of the action,
exactly.
Yeah,
that's what's allowed that's what's allowed the lower order human, the limbic, to survive this long and afford the opportunity to develop the precortical capacity, which is the capacity that can contemplate things like compound interest and
It's that,
the more
you know,
the far more abstract, the imagination of possible futures. Okay, well, thanks for letting me dwell on that a little bit. If you got any other remarks on it, go for it. Otherwise,
no, I
thank
think
you.
I think that's what he keeps saying. You know, I think hybrid. It's a you can't have a broad enough view to choose for the future, and so you're only concerned with what satiates you in the moment or relieves your anxiety. Actually, I think would be another way to say that. That's my understanding.
So if you go, have we talked about the 4E cognitive model amongst ourselves so far? Is that familiar with? Are you guys all familiar with that?
What is it again?
So the 4E model of cognition, embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended.
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay,
It hasn't come up yet. It doesn't come up yet. I think it does come up later.
We'll get to that. Okay, that's it's another helpful construct.
I'm glad you brought that up, Kim, because I kept seeing it and I kept forgetting what it meant. So it's really good that you said that. So now it's kind of
mentioned. So like Anu was talking about theory of mind. As he's saying that, I'm thinking that's the extended. That's the extended cognition. And Peterson ad nauseum talks about the narrative into the future, and as you extend the sense of identity out into the community,
exactly. Into the future of the community and for the betterment of everything.
That's an antidote to that hyperbolic discounting.
Exactly. And also they touch about in the first part of 14, he says that here's how he kind of frames it. The philosophers can cure your existential suffering. So fear equals threat. Anxiety is even worse. It's like nebulous threat. The antidote is radical acceptance of morality, right? And what that leads to is realizing that you have to pay attention to the things that give you the most value, right? So now we go back, like Peterson talks about
That's
this
the
too.
Epicurean. That's the Epicurean development. Yep.
Exactly. So friendship, pursuit of wisdom, and self-transcendence would be in that category. And of course, it would not be to gain, you know, to live as long as possible is your only goal, or to gather as much power or money, because those will are as Buddha would say, are temporary, or what do they call it? They what does he say? They fade. I mean, they don't last, right? They're not. And then also, you know, the difference. Well, this is different. We should go to this. Maybe you guys want to comment on that, because there's another section I'm kind of interested in talking about the difference between morals and purity codes, which I thought was an absolutely fascinating concept, and I'm glad I learned. So, do you guys have any thoughts about that first section that I just mentioned?
You're moving into 14. You're saying into the
we are.
The next.
Oh yeah, we're in 14, aren't we?
Yep.
Oh,
We
okay,
are.
good.
Your comments, Vish or Cam?
What's that?
I'm just inviting you to comment or thoughts.
Well, so playing off of what you were saying, Michael, so the cynics, as I understood it this time, were the ones that they were trying to separate that disgust response, which was associated with purity code, from moral judgment, which is a moral code, to disassociate those things. And he made the point about the demonstration of the lantern and the whoever that character was that was walking around in the market amongst all the immoral players.
Oh, that he says, I'm looking for an honest man.
What are you looking for? He says, I'm looking for one honest man or something like that.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
The same guy was the one that he would come in and he would masturbate in public there. And that it wasn't, he was making the point that was not an immoral act. It's just disgusting.
It's just that people consider it's a purity code that and therefore people have that, you know, that disgust response, but it's not the same as murdering someone, or, you know, that, or stealing from someone or something like that, in his opinion, which I thought was, or that's what their opinion is, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, so the disassociation of those two things, it is, I mean, I learned that quite a while ago in some relational study stuff where if you, I think it had to do with studies of married couples where if there were certain patterns of speech that revealed the disgust response, it was like the probability of divorce was, I don't remember what it was, but it was.
That's right. That's
It
right.
was
You're
more
talking about John Gottman's work.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah,
John Gottman, who
I
predicted.
really like his work, and I think it's amazing what he's done in terms of clarifying. You know, you want to get divorced, you know, be contemptuous towards your partner. That'll do it the fastest. That kind of thing.
So reminds me of this disgust versus moral code response is Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind.
Righteous Mind, yeah.
He discusses a lot about what underlies moral code and what are the universal components of moral code across cultures,
I love
and
that book.
why different people might have different importance or valence to different parts. And he talks about how certain groups who might be much more attuned to disgust and purity might be more conservative, as an example. And I'm not passing value judgment as much as an observation, right? Purity codes in religions are meant to preserve, the groups that are more alarmed by some of the behavior. So it's an interesting distinction, and I think it cuts across cultures as well.
Well, it's interesting what a disgust response would be in a liberal compared to a conservative, because we all have it. It's just framed differently.
Some of the disgust response is visceral, like horror, like looking at trash, or disgusting smells or disgusting foods. Those are all visceral, hard-coded responses. Is how I saw it.
Where were you going with the liberal?
I was just commenting on your observation here about purity code versus moral code, and I'm just saying, in the modern interpretation of that, according to Jonathan Haidt, is very interesting.
It's a great book.
Michael, though, was starting to say something about the
the liberals have a different disgust response than conservatives do, generally speaking.
What is that? What's the distinction?
Well, like a conservative would find it, in a sense, offensive to have people streaming over the border of the southern United States. Where liberals tend to think, isn't it great that these poor people that have been traumatized and mistreated and their economies destabilized by American activity are coming here and having a better chance?
Where's the disgust in those two?
Well, the liberal would be disgusted by the idea potentially of being married to the same person your whole life.
So I think this is where there's a distinction here. You are using disgust metaphorically, whereas Jonathan Haidt and the example in Stoics and Cynics is being literal. Like there's a evocation of disgust across communities by certain actions, whereas these political propositional views might evoke anger, etc., but it's not disgust in the physical, literal sense, the way you would get disgusted by certain.
Well, I mean, I'm not so sure that's true.
That's how I understand it.
Because I grew up with a hippie culture where nudity was considered natural and okay, where most of American culture does not see it that way even to this day. I mean, I have no trouble being naked in front of people, but a lot of people have trouble in this country with that idea. And if you go to Europe, like where my girlfriend's from, the Czech Republic, it's normal for people that work together to go to a sauna and they all take off their clothes. And, no problem, and it, here,
that does sound more of a moral code, though, compared to.
I don't think so, because
the disgust. I think about.
You might be right, but I'm not sure about that.
Wasn't
you're right.
I might be talking off the top of my head here, but wasn't the beginning of the Nazi actions around sanitation?
Absolutely.
So there was a disgust response. That visceral. There's a biological pathogen present that is causing a sensitivity that you know, the disgust response at that visceral level is at that level.
I mean,
And
they frame the Jews as
adaptive.
rodents, basically.
It's
Sorry.
healthy. It's a healthy response to be disgusted. The stench of rotten food, because it'll wreck your guts.
But it can be distorted too, like
Well,
saying
also,
distortion
just
is
to,
the
to Michael's
distortion
point, though,
is the misapprehension of that or the assignment of that disgust response to a moral
exactly
issue,
there's a confusion.
Not what the original biological disgust response, physiological disgust response, why it was evolutionarily conserved in the first place.
Yeah, he said that there's a confusion there often where people think that disgust, they think disgust is morality, but it isn't. It's, in other words, is there anything truly morally wrong with someone masturbating in public? Well, a lot of people might think yes, but because you can masturbate otherwise, and it's at least fine for a lot of people, then it's, you know, it's like he says, I don't want to see my parents having sex. I would be disgusted by that, but it doesn't mean it's morally wrong for them to have sex. I don't want to be there. Which I have to agree with that. Personally as well. So, yeah.
But just going back to your example, Michael, like I feel like, I mean, there's the disgust response, but there's also, I think it's the guilt versus shame. Is that the distinction that he makes?
Yeah, guilt meaning morals, shame being purity codes. That's how.
So I can totally see in your example how people would try and shame someone who was, you know, trying to walk around without their clothes on, even if it didn't provoke maybe a visceral, tangible, like disgust response, right? Maybe it does on some level.
I think it has to, because otherwise you wouldn't respond that way. You just look at, oh, it's a naked person. Who cares a shit? Like, you know, in the commune where I lived, people walked around naked all summer long, you know, just boots on or whatever, and working in the field. And I mean, it's pretty funny. But, you know, I got so used to it, it didn't, you know, no problem for me to this day. Especially because everyone's attitude was the same. So that helps. But
the other thing that struck me, maybe this is related to what you were saying about sort of conservative versus liberal, because it seems like a lot of what the intent of a purity code is to keep a culture going the way that it already was. And it feels like much more of a conservative outlook where the things that have happened so far or the tradition that you've followed is how things should proceed as well. And so I would expect there to be more purity codes if you're more conservative, and more flexibility or fewer purity codes if you weren't.
you know,
But I would be curious to hear if that makes sense to you.
I think you're right on in a more balanced sense, but when you get to the extremes, it's no different. Because you have the quote woke movement.
That is a very good
just as bad as, I mean, there's so much like the ugly conservatives I used to be disgusted by as a kid. It's just no distinction. It's just that they use different, you know, framing. You know, instead of original sin, it's that you're white.
So
right?
this is where the conservative with a big C, the political definitions of those labels don't apply.
That's not what I'm appealing to.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So it appeals. So there is the righteous mind talks about the tendency to preserve order, right? And that's conservatism across cultures, right? Versus openness to new experiences, which is the idea of an experience, which is more of a liberal view. But these are psychological traits of people combined, not necessarily tied to any political
very
statements,
good points.
Right?
So here, let me try to
political
use better
statements
words.
are meaningless.
Yeah.
The propositional content is not what we are talking about.
Let me rephrase. I think dogmatic people have a higher set of purity codes versus maybe people who you would characterize as more open-minded, regardless of other affiliations.
I think they confuse morality with disgust response too more often than most people. I think that just, since we're on that, that's my impression.
Yeah.
I actually had a question, or I guess a doubt about that as well, which is, I get this distinction, right? We're sort of separating purity codes and morality, but it's not clear to me, or at least I wasn't able to convince myself that purity codes still weren't a subset of morals, just contextual morals.
That's where I was saying Jonathan Haidt's framework is much more evolved and modern than morality versus purity code. I just think that distinction is not, it might have worked historically for cynics and stoics, but I don't think that's the current view
Got it.
because of how we have studied morality across cultures today, where purity and disgust response is just one of the components across all moral codes,
Yeah, I
rather
think that
than two separate things.
I would put it down and move on. I mean, I'm
Yes.
happy to continue to list, but
We
I
should.
agree.
We should.
Like, just listening to the quality of our conversation on the topic, my estimation is that it's pretty poor, and it's because we don't. It's been over a year since I've looked at that work by Haidt that you're talking about, so I'm not versed into it at all. But I do have a sense of the nuance that you're referring to, and we just don't. Sorry, guys, but we just don't have it right now.
Marcus Aurelius and Jesus. That's episode 15. Should we try that for the next 15 minutes?
Well, we skipped right over the Stoics. You want to touch on them at all?
Sure. Anyone who has any questions, I'm happy to. Like.
Well,
about Stoics?
Go ahead.
Well, no, I thought that it was my takeaway of Stoics is it was very short. Stoicism equals internalizing Socrates' question and answer process and living as he did in that way, is what I understood. Their main goal is in terms of, so in embodying Socrates is what the Stoics were they were trying to do. Because, Marcus Aurelius would go through these processes where he would he would say, okay, what is sex? It's a friction, resulting in a sticky fluid, and and paying attention to how we assume and assign identities to things. I think that's the other part of what they talked about as well.
Yeah,
is that right?
I think the whole chapter 15 about Marcus Aurelius substantially, not all of it, half of it is about Stoicism. And what's interesting to me is that Stoicism right now is a rage everywhere, so popular. Like there are more Stoics alive today than ever were during Greek time. So in a certain way, it has had its resurgence. And all the books of Stoics, from Epictetus to Aurelius to Seneca, are very popular. And so I think that's what's interesting to me. And the fact that it is it's like precursor to CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's basically a set of psychotricks, psychotechnologies to manage anxiety and to manage events that are out of control, is how I see it.
I think it's a good way to say it, yeah.
What Buddhists and Hindus had discovered 2,000 before Stoics did, Stoics got a lighter version of that, like a Cliff Note version of that, is how I see it. I'm not being dismissive. I'm just saying culturally, it's a lighter thread of what would it take to go deeper into transformational experience. Because Stoicism doesn't promise transformation. It just promises management.
Yeah, what do you call it? As best management as you can have.
Exactly.
Right. I think it's interesting too that one of the things I was wondering about this course is whether he would recommend practices. And I'm realizing he actually is, because he talks about the Stoics, I don't know how to say this right. Prosh, is that how you say it? Paying attention to how you pay attention.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have the other one, which is prosciuron, remembering in a modality, a modally existential sense, how to solve the 9-dot problem. So you have to break frame to be able to do that, to solve. And so I guess the combination of those two practices, and as well as objective seeing. Oh yeah. So here's some of the other practices: objective seeing, and like when you with someone, you say to yourself, and there's different ways to say this. And tomorrow you may die. So you're being aware of death as a motivation to be as present in a quality way with that person as possible, and then the view from above, and also when you say something like I'm a failure at everything, you can be logical and say, really, well, you got here without dying, so obviously that's not the case. I mean, that kind of stuff. So the goal is not a long life, but a life well lived, right? That was the other thing that I got out out of the 15.
Vish, what was your take on 15 or the Stoics?
Some of it we already spoke through. I think sort of what fatality actually is, I found fascinating. This is not what I assumed it would be. I think I appreciated, well, Anu, you said this already, but thanks to Ryan Holiday, I think primarily Stoicism is like really on fire today. And I can't help but think that there's also some element of our contextual environment today, right? The same things that are drawing people to Buddhism also draw people to Stoicism because it's still offering a way to better manage the difficulties that you're facing in today's times. But I completely agree with you. I came to the same conclusion that you did, Anu. I think the difference I see between Buddhism and Stoicism is the focus on how you lead your internal life, or is the focus on how it helps you be effective externally? And I also saw that Stoicism was much more oriented towards here's how you can, carpe diem, whereas Buddhism is like, here's how the cessation of suffering can be achieved.
Well, also the Stoics believe that wisdom equals knowing what you can control and what you can't.
Yeah.
And only focusing on that which you can. They have 3 categories. That which you can control, that what they have some control, and what you should ignore completely because you have no control. Right. So that's pretty, that actually, and I think that does alleviate suffering too, because if
it does.
Right?
So I feel both Buddhism and Stoicism will improve internal and external interactions. But the narrative that it comes to you with, like, for example, one of the ways that I would see Stoicism is that he's actually attempting to change my propositional worldview to one that supports this notion of, mortality and accepting mortality and fatality, right? It's not asking me to engage in some participatory knowledge that steps me out of that frame. It's instead trying to mold my frame to one that is more conducive to being okay no matter what happens.
That's right.
So again, different approaches. They both have benefits, internal and external, but it just felt like the narrative was different.
And contextually, it made sense historically the way Vervaeke describes it. Stoicism came out of domicile when people lost their homes and were trying to make sense of the chaos around them, and the events around them were more out of control than ever before. And whereas Buddhism came out of an attempt to resolve full universal suffering, which is like a higher order problem, right?
That's right. Yeah, because that makes sense because when the instability happened, they realized how impermanent certain things were in that instability, and then you had to find a way to deal with that effectively, right?
Yeah.
Because when they also mentioned that they also distinguish between the being mode equals peace and having mode equals suffering. So it's very parallel to what Buddha said as well.
Yeah. Even the spheres of what you control versus what you don't. It's very Zen, right? It's right up there.
If I may propose that we conclude our session at the moment.
Before we do,
pick up the second part afterwards.
We should conclude. Cam's expression makes me believe that there's something he disagrees with, and I want to know what.
Cam, you have the last word for today.
I'm with Anu because you get into Christ and you get into love, and we just don't. We're just not gonna make.
We don't have time for that.
No, we should not open a new topic now.
No, that's going to take much more time to do justice to. Right?
We should pick it up there. Exactly. We should pick up session 15, second part.
Yeah. Thank you. I agree 100%. That's not to be rushed through that one.
Well, okay. Well, thank you for that.